This is Charlie Crockett, Texas musician and descendant of Davy Crockett, inviting you to visit the Alamo. It's not the same Alamo you, remember. There's lots of new things to experience, like the 500 artifacts inside the Alamo exhibit at the Ralston Family Collection Center, the new Mission Gate and Lunette outdoor exhibit, and Surrounded, the Alamo Augmented Experience. It's all part of an ongoing restoration and expansion that will write the Alamo's next chapter. So don't wait. Plan your visit today at thealamo.org.
Stories bigger than Texas, the Alamo Podcast. It's a big day for us at the Alamo Podcast. Not only are we celebrating our 2-year anniversary, today is our 100th episode. We are marking the occasion with a special look at the Texas Centennial. Today we reveal how the Lone Star State celebrated 100 years of independence, where on Alamo grounds you'll see symbols of the milestone, and the efforts in Dallas to preserve that critical first century of Texas history. I'm your host, Emily Balcom. We begin our look at the Texas Centennial with the Alamo senior historian, Ernesto Rodriguez. Ernesto, how did Texas plan for this centennial celebration?
They started looking at ways to honor the defenders of not only the Alamo, but the men at Goliad and the entire revolution as a whole. And so they had meetings trying to figure this out. And it's really interesting because the Centennial is the era where the people of the revolution go from being just regular individuals to being big heroes. We put them up on pedestals because we were remembering the courageous fight for Texas independence. And so they're planning this, and they're talking not only amongst themselves, but they're talking to the federal government as well, because this is huge, right? Not just because I'm a Texan, but because it really is. Texas Revolution really changes the course of American history. So they're looking to find partnerships, and the federal government becomes a great partner for us.
Federal money was spent on the Texas Centennial.
Yes, it was. And you think about, when are we celebrating the Centennial? It's during the Great Depression. So there's a push to put people to work. And what better way to do it than having a project this big to celebrate Texas independence? So they start putting people to work here.
So a lot of the projects we're about to talk about are from the Works Progress Administration.
Mm-hmm. Yep, a lot of them are.
Special attention was paid to the Alamo as the cradle of Texas independence, and money was set aside to improve the grounds.
Yes, it was. And so they started looking at the grounds in the back and doing a garden, Centennial Garden, and you can still walk through that same Centennial Garden. You know, it's about to be reconfigured in a way, but it's still there. And then they decide that the state wants to have 10 Centennial museums, and one of them will be located right here at the Alamo. So money is set aside and construction begins. And it's always interesting to read the reports coming from the Daughters of the Republic of Texas that were the custodians at the time, talking about how great it was when this building opened, right, which was the Gift Museum at that time, because they were able to display artifacts. They were able to do it in a place that was actually spread out, and they were also able to sell merchandise to keep the site open.
And now it is our gift shop today for the time being. But the architecture of that original museum is really meant to blend in with the Mission-era church.
Yes, it is. It's supposed to blend in with the Mission-era church. And so you'll notice that it has art. When you walk up to it, it has niches. It has the columns. It also has a Franciscan at the top of the keystone, but the frieze doesn't match because that was changed out when they started construction. They decided to go away from the mission motif and do more of a Alamo-related thing with cowboys and the Alamo the way we know it today. But it was all part of this big project to showcase the greatness of the independence movement.
And you can still see a plaque today on the side of what's now our gift shop, marking it as the original Alamo Museum built in 1936 to celebrate the Texas Centennial.
Yep. And if you look at the back, there's also one that says partially funded by federal government. And that one's made out of granite.
The other structure built to mark the Centennial is the Alamo Cenotaph, also known as the Spirit of Sacrifice.
Yes. And the Spirit of Sacrifice, they went through this process of trying to find an artist to do it. And one of the artists that tried to get the job was Borglum, who would later on build Mount Rushmore. And so the gentleman that won was Pompeo Capini. And Pompeo Capini is an Italian-born artist that also had his hands in a lot of projects here in San Antonio. And one of the things that he did was he created the spirit of sacrifice. He also came up with the coin that would be minted by the U.S. government for the Centennial. But it's one of those interesting things because you have the cenotaph go up, and it's unfortunately is not completed until 1940. But with its completion, now you've got a monument to remember the defenders of the Battle of the Alamo. On the opposite side of the church, you've got the arcade, which is also one of those projects that was started. And you also have the memorial well or fountain that has the names of the defenders, Crockett, Bowie, Travis, and Bonham. And you look at that, and it's a time when we're remembering our past. And it was a perfect time because the U.S. was going through one of its darkest moments. And to be able to look at this battle and the Texas Revolution as a whole and go, something great came out of that, and I'm part of it. And it's really special because those are standing legacies today where you can come and you can see part of that history.
The cenotaph is currently undergoing important restoration work and is being repaired in place to ensure it stands the test of time. When people walk past, I really see them paying attention to the statues on the sides of various defenders. But there's one statue on the southern side that's very tall. Who is that depicting?
That is the spirit of sacrifice, and it's the soul of the defenders rising up from the ashes, because that's what the Alamo did, right? If you really think about the Alamo story, out of the ashes of defeat rose a new nation, because the battle cry at San Jacinto, remember the Alamo, remember La Bahia, God in Texas. And when you think about that, that truly shows the spirit rising up from the unfortunate loss of the Alamo defenders.
As America is trying to do at this time during the Great Depression.
They're trying to rise up, and this is a perfect way to show it. And on the other side, you have the goddess Liberty. And so you think about it, these are two really important figures, and the spirit of sacrifice itself is much bigger than the others. It makes us think. So if you ever have a chance to stand there and look at it, especially once it's completed, when the sun hits that white Georgia marble, it actually glows really bright so that you can see the spirit rising. And it's really important because this is one of those things where they had money and they decided, what shall we do to remember? And the best way to do it is through a memorial, which is commonly called the cenotaph, right? The empty tomb. And you look at it, and it's the more you study it, the more you appreciate it, because it truly is the spirit of sacrifice that's depicted on it.
If the cenotaph is the most grand reminder of the Texas Centennial on the grounds, I'm going to transition to maybe the tiniest. You really have to look when you're walking around this area. But they also added for the Centennial these little plaques in the ground that say Original Mission Property Line.
Yes, the Daughters of the Republic of Texas made it a point that they wanted people to know what the original mission property line was. And so they went and they marked them in these little brass markers. And so as you're walking around the grounds, you may not see one in front, but on the sides, especially if you're on Houston Street, you can see them. And if you make your way down Alamo Street to the corner of the Gibbs building, there's one right there showing where the north wall ended. And it's really important because it allows people to actually get a glimpse of how big this property really was, and that it's not just the church and the long barrack. There's a lot more. And luckily, with the new Visitor Center and Museum, we're basically enclosing the entire property so that people can know that the minute they come through the Mission Gate, they're somewhere special.
The state of Texas also hosted a grand Texas Centennial exposition in Dallas, attended by more than 6 million people over the course of 6 months. Here to share more is David Lee from the Dallas Historical Society. David, the San Antonio native in me has to ask, okay, Dallas was not established as a city until 1841. That's 5 years after Texas won its independence. So how did Dallas become the home to this grand centennial celebration?
I think many Texans had the same thoughts as you did in the lead up to the Centennial. As you mentioned, Dallas didn't even exist during the Texas Revolution. If we had a time machine and could come back to North Texas, we would see buffalo and wildlife and bands of Native Americans moving through the area, but no permanent Anglo settlement. It really comes down to Dallas made the best offer. The state had been talking about, there had been preliminary plans and discussions going back as early as 1923 with a meeting of advertisers and editorial writers. And it was really an opportunity to showcase Texas. By 1934, the state really started to get a little more serious, and the legislature put together something called the Texas Centennial Commission. And that first question was where to host the celebration. The city had to have three major responsibilities. The first was to provide the land, and the goal was to have around 200 acres, all of the utilities, and then also the largest cash contribution. There were initially 5 cities interested. Austin and Fort Worth started proposals, but quickly dropped out, leaving San Antonio, Houston, and Dallas. The Dallas Commission was led by a banker and business leader named Robert Lee Thornton, and his job was to organize and present the proposal to bring the Centennial to Dallas. As we said, many people thought, of course, it's going to be San Antonio. That's the site of the Alamo, the cradle of Texas liberty. Houston has the San Jacinto battlefield close by. So why would Dallas even be considered? But Dallas did have some advantages. The first was Fair Park itself, a city-owned 183-acre property. It had hosted the State Fair of Texas since 1886. Dallas also had the dynamic leadership of Thornton and the Dallas business community that offered $7.8 million in funding. And that was an offer that they said stood even if the federal and state government did not contribute any additional funding. In comparison, San Antonio offered $4.8 million and Houston offered $6.5 million. So I think that's kind of the Dallas way. We're going to do it bigger. We're going to do it better. Let's do it here.
This was born out of the idea of a World's Fair, which was a really big deal at the time.
You know, it's interesting that it's marketed as a World's Fair, but as far as I can tell, it was not an official World's Fair. It's not like the Chicago World's Fair or these other expos that took place, but it did have some similarities in that the Texas Centennial was as much about advertising, industry, scientific achievement, and advancement as it was about commemorating the Centennial itself. So in some ways, I can't say for sure, but I suspect that was more marketing than an official designation.
It was held at the state fairgrounds, as you said, throughout 50 buildings, the grandest of which is the Hall of State, a beautiful Art Deco building where your group, the Dallas Historical Society, is based today, and people can come see it.
Absolutely. The building, along with the other buildings at Fair Park, is the largest surviving collection of Art Deco buildings in the world. We have visitors from all over. Just in the short time that I've been working for the Historical Society, we've had visitors from Europe and Asia that come to see the architecture. The Hall of State, unlike some of the buildings, was intended to be a permanent shrine and museum of Texas history. Some of the buildings were later demolished, but the Hall of State was intended to be permanent. Of the funding provided for the Centennial, $1.2 million was specifically designated for what was called the State of Texas building at that time. $1 million for the design and construction, and another $200,000 for the interior furnishings. Interestingly enough, it was not complete when the Centennial opened in June. The exterior appeared complete, but you could not enter until midway through the Centennial. Workers were still inside finishing out the details. Part of that is related to a labor issue. We don't really think today of Texas as being a strong organized labor state, but much of the work on the building was done by union workers, and the bricklayers had not been paid their wages for working on the weekend, Saturdays and Sundays, in the rush to complete the building. And the other unions all went on a sympathy strike. Enter Robert Thornton again, where he raises the back wages over the course of a weekend, and on Monday they went back to work.
That's fascinating.
It is a magnificent structure, and I can't help but be amazed when I contemplate that they built it in less than a year. The foundation work started in December of 35. The Centennial opens in June of 1936, and the interior of the building opened in September of 1936. So as magnificent and stately as it is, definitely done under time constraint.
So when you walk into a concourse called the Hall of Heroes. What's in there?
It is dominated, it's a semicircular room by 6 massive, larger-than-life bronze statues depicting heroes from the Texas Revolution. William Travis, Thomas Russ, Sam Houston, Stephen Austin, Mirabeau Lamar, and James Fannin. The Centennial Commission surveyed 300 Texas historians, asking them to identify the most influential leaders of the Texas Revolution. The statues were created by an artist named Pompeo Capini, an Italian-born sculptor. He did a lot of work in Texas. He maintained a home in San Antonio.
Right. Alamo podcast listeners will know that he sculpted the Alamo Cenotaph, which we talked about earlier in this episode.
And a lot of work at the state capitol as well. A little bit of a controversial choice. There were some Texas artists that, accused him of only maintaining a Texas address for business purposes, but quite popular sculptor for that time period. The choice is interesting too. Most of these figures visitors remember, but we often get questions about Thomas Rusk as well as Lamar. But we remember that the statues and the building itself is a depiction of Texas history as seen by Texans in 1936. So one of the beautiful things about our building is it's a time capsule, not only of Texas history, but also of how that generation of Texans saw their history. I suspect if we did this project today, we might have a different 6 individuals lining the Hall of the Heroes.
And when you walk further into the Hall of State, the centerpiece is the Great Hall. Can you describe it for us and the beautiful murals on the wall?
The room that you're referring to has been described as one of the most outstanding Art Deco spaces in the nation. And it's hard to argue with that description once you've seen it. It's overwhelmingly magnificent. At 94 by 68 feet with almost 50-foot tall ceilings, it is a monumental space. Interestingly enough, unlike most of the art in the rest of the building, the work in the Great Hall was not done by local Texas artists. The artists chosen to decorate the Great Hall were from the faculty at Yale University. Again, this was controversial because a lot of Texas artists were wanting to work that were in the midst of the Great Depression, but the Centennial Commissioners wanted nationally recognized names. At the end of the hall on the east wall is the massive 25-foot tall Great Medallion, clad in 3 different colors of gold leaf, depicting the 6 nations that have governed Texans. It was designed by a firm of Adam and Adams and sculpted by Joseph Rainier, again, Yale University faculty member. On the ceiling, there are images referencing Aztec art designed by an artist named George Davidson. And on the floor in the marble inset are mosaic depictions of iconic Texas animals like the horned frog, the mockingbird, and the javelina. And one thing to remember when you visit the Hall of State is that every element, every design choice references some part of Texas history or Texas culture. But the real showpiece in the room are the massive murals done by Eugene Savage.
Those murals really tell the story of Texas.
They do. As you enter the room on the left, there's a mural titled The Texas of History. And that mural depicts the European arrival, the Spanish and French, as well as the Anglo colonists meeting together at the central moment of the Alamo and Texas independence. And throughout, there are hundreds of different figures, not all of them, but most of them identified by name. I like to joke with students that the Great Hall would be the best room in the world to take a Texas history test because the answers surround you. You're surrounded by Sam Houston and Santa Anna and the Alamo defenders, Crockett and Bowie and Travis. You see DeSoto and Cortez. It's a really amazing visual depiction of that particular era of Texas history. That takes us up to 1836. On the opposite wall, we have the mural called The Texas of Today, which again is the today of 1936. So we see the frontier, cattle drives, the annexation of Texas to the United States, the end of the Civil War. There's a section depicting Texas education, President Lamar leading the children of Texas into the future. And then a final section depicts the industry of Texas in 1936. So we have timber, the petroleum industry, and other industrial activities in Texas. Again, the Centennial is showcasing Texas history. It's also advertising Texas to the rest of the world and to the United States. Come to Texas. Look what we have to offer. We've got a great thing going here. Come join us.
The Hall of State also has 4 more rooms labeled North, South, East, and West, representing the different geographical quadrants of Texas. You were kind enough to give me a tour earlier this year, and I'm sure it came as no surprise to you that my favorite was the South Room. Tell us why that was my favorite and what's in there.
Well, before I get to the reason that I suspect it's your favorite room, each of the rooms features art showcasing life in that region of Texas. And so different artists were selected. As you come into the South Texas room, you will see a mural by James Owen Mahoney Jr. depicting the life of the Rio Grande Valley, and other art on the columns showcasing the agriculture and the way of life in South Texas. We use that room to hold our magnificent Texas Liberty Forever Alamo diorama. There's a 336 square foot diorama created by a man named Thomas Feely, who, believe it or not, is from Pennsylvania. He also constructed an earlier diorama, a smaller scale one that was in the Alamo gift shop for many years. As a child, Mr. Feely was impressed and captivated by the story of the Alamo as presented by the Fess Parker television show and later the John Wayne film, like many of his generation. And over 20 years, he painstakingly crafted this diorama. It has over 2,000 hand-painted figures. He spent many years in San Antonio during the summer. He and his wife maintained an apartment near the Alamo, and he worked with the research staff and the curators to ensure that this diorama is as accurate as possible.
And let's repeat that, 336 square feet. It is huge.
It really is. It takes the entire room. It is a permanent exhibit. There's no way we could easily move it and relocate it. And we also have developed a immersive digital app that helps tell the Alamo story in English and in Spanish through some of the leading figures that were there. So when we have school groups come out, when we have visitors, they can use that app to dive even deeper into the Alamo story. We're really fortunate to have it. When I came on board and joined the Historical Society, one of the first things I did was read a history of our founder, George Bannerman Dealey. And what I found was that in 1909, Mr. Dealey funded out of his own pocket a Alamo replica for the fairgrounds because he said, quote, "The great mass of people of North Texas never have the opportunity to see the Alamo, but they can see and study this exact replica of the original, and thus will be created or augmented in the minds of the younger generation a patriotic feeling and pride for the noble band which fought for the freedom we now enjoy," end quote. And when I found that quote, I ran down the hall to our director and I said, look at this. We are fulfilling Mr. Dealey's original vision and mission through this Alamo exhibit.
What
Not
a cool
everyone can make
find.
it. Absolutely. Not everyone can make it to San Antonio, but for those that can't, come down to Fair Park, come to the Hall of State, learn about the Alamo, learn about Texas history right here in your own backyard.
And let's go through each of the other rooms to describe what's in there. Even though the South room I'm partial to, the others are still very cool to explore.
So leading into the South room is our North Texas room. In that room is the only painting that is a fresco, actually painted directly onto the plaster. The other work was done on canvas, brought to the Hall of State, and then installed, which makes sense when you consider how quickly they were constructing the building. The fresco was painted by a gentleman named Arthur Starr Niendorf, local Texas artist, and it showcases life in our region of Texas. There's banking and industry and agriculture, and also an interesting character known as Old Man Texas. He's largely forgotten today, but he was created by the Dallas Morning News editorial cartoonist named John Knott. He worked from about 1911 to the 1950s. During that era, Old Man Texas was widely recognized across the United States as a symbol of Texas, of common sense, small government, low taxes. He's been compared to Uncle Sam or John Bull of England. And we know that's Old Man Texas because tucked away into the mural is a rolled up newspaper that has the first depiction of him in the morning news.
Oh, how cool.
So a nice little Easter egg there. The North Texas room also features Oratone prints. These are special photographic prints on glass plates done by a photographer named Polly Smith. She was commissioned by the Centennial to photograph scenes of life in Texas. Some of her work is also available in the East Texas room because when they were starting to advertise for the Centennial, they quickly realized they didn't have a lot of great photographs to work from. And so those beautiful images, great depth and clarity, showcase aspects of life in Texas. We use the North Texas room to showcase some of our collection of early Texas history. So we have artifacts that go back to the Mission period and then Anglo colonization and then the Texas Revolution. Some of the highlights are one of the letters that Sam Houston wrote after the Battle of San Jacinto, documenting for the first time the use of the battle cry, "Remember the Alamo, remember Goliad." Speaking of Goliad, we have Colonel Fannon's watch that was taken from him after his execution by the Mexican army. We have part of his uniform, his epaulets, the only remaining part of his uniform, and then some items captured from Santa Anna after the Battle of San Jacinto, including the flag that flew outside of his headquarters, a pair of his spurs, and some items from his desk. He didn't travel lightly, so he had a lot of nice things, and Sam Houston doled those out as gifts to friends and family members after the battle. We're fortunate to have a few of those items on display in the North Texas room. Moving across through the Hall of the Heroes on the other side of the building, you enter the East Texas room, which we use kind of as a changing exhibit space. We rotate in and out different types of exhibits there. The art in that room was done by a Dallas artist named Olin Travis. And there are two murals on either side of the room that depict life in East Texas. The East Texas of the past, which showcases timber and cotton, and then the East Texas of today, showing the East Texas oil patch of the 1930s. And there's a really interesting connection between those two images. I'm not going to give it away because we'd like visitors to come out and see it for themselves, but that's a wonderful room as well. And then our final room is the West Texas room, which we also use as our G.B. Dealey Research Library. I know I probably shouldn't have a favorite, but it's hard not to fall in love with the West Texas room. The walls are decorated to look like adobe and feature the brands of famous Texas cattle ranches, such as the King Ranch and the XIT and the 4.6s. The paintings in that room were done by the famous El Paso artist Tom Lee, showcasing a pioneer family and a West Texas cowboy. There's a wooden statue of a cowboy and beautiful tile work, all evoking the ranching culture and the life of West Texas. As I said, we use that as our research library. In addition to being a museum and maintaining the Hall of State, we also have a collection of almost 3 million artifacts, and writers, researchers, graduate students come down and access our materials as they're doing their work. But you can visit that room too. Each room is unique, and it's a wonderful array of life in Texas and Texas culture to come and visit the Hall of State.
All of these areas of the Hall of State are still open to the public today, but take us back to 1936. What would we have seen then? I know you mentioned for the first half of this expo, it was still under construction, but what about the second half?
Well, when it opened, it would have been completely full of historical exhibits and artifacts of Texas history from the 1500s all the way up until 1936. The Commission and the Dallas Historical Society sent out letters across the state of Texas to every museum, historical society, historical auxiliary ladies library group, and said, hey, if you've got Texas artifacts, if you have important mementos of Texas history, consider sending them in for the Centennial. We'll put them on display. We want this to be the world's best exhibition of Texas history. And people sent them in. They mailed them in from across the state of Texas. That was really the genesis of our collection. The Historical Society was founded in 1922, so they had been collecting things and preserving things from local history. But many of those people that sent items in chose to contribute them to the permanent Dallas Historical Society collection. So that's where many of those items originated from, and each room would have had a different era of Texas history. There were special display cases constructed, which we still use. When you come visit the Hall of State and you look at the artifacts, many of those exhibit cases are original to 1936 with custom wood inlay, the star motif. We have to be a little careful because the glass wasn't tempered in that era, so when we move them and adjust them, but it's a wonderful way to showcase our exhibits. But that's what you would have seen. If you came back to the Hall of State when the doors opened in 1936, it would have been completely full of Texas history, artifacts, and exhibits.
We talked about how the Texas Centennial Exposition was spread throughout the state fairgrounds inside of 50 buildings. What else was there for people to explore? You mentioned that Alamo replica, for example.
There was an Alamo replica. There was a second one constructed. The first one that was built in 1909 was actually torn down sometime in 1935 or 1936, and a second Alamo replica was constructed in the southwest corner of the park, kind of over where the garden center is located. And it was a really popular spot for visitors. I believe you could go inside and there were picnic tables. So if you wanted to have your lunch there, it was a great spot. It was later torn down in the early 1950s. I'm not sure on
What
the
a
exact date
shame.
of that. Absolutely. But there would have been just a wide array of things to do. Of course, there was a midway and there were rides and your typical fair booths, but also there were exhibits by different corporations showcasing their technology. Chrysler and automotive companies would have had exhibits and displays, not just advertising their products, but showing how they work. So there's an educational element to it as well. Petroleum companies, there were theaters, there was, of course, the Cavalcade of Texas. In the evening, there were nightclubs and there was evening entertainment and floor shows. They made an effort to try to provide something for everyone. My grandmother was a little girl during the Centennial, and I remember her telling me that she said every relative we had in East Texas came and spent a weekend with us in Dallas and went to the Centennial. It's really hard to imagine. I wish we had a time machine. It also would have been brilliantly illuminated at night. And there's some wonderful photographs that capture kind of the rays of light over the Esplanade, over the Hall of State, just shimmering and showcasing this exposition that they called it Magic City, to give you an idea of how people viewed it.
That sounds incredible. Now, your group, the Dallas Historical Society, as we said, maintains the Hall of State today. It's this grand visual reminder of the Texas Centennial. And while you do collect and display more modern Texas history, what do you think the overall legacy is of that Centennial celebration?
You know, I think the Centennial encapsulates the Texas spirit in the midst of the Great Depression. And people forget that during the 1930s, Texas was still largely an agricultural state. A large majority of Texans relied on cotton, and cotton prices had collapsed. Oil had provided a little glimmer of hope, but overproduction had flooded the market. So in the midst of that Great Depression, the leaders of Texas and the leaders of Dallas decided we're going to put on an exposition, a centennial, that dwarfs anything previously seen. And I think it encapsulates that can-do Texas spirit. I also think it represents a turning point in Texas history, because after 1936, Texas seems to have entered the national consciousness in a way that it hadn't previously. The Centennial, from everything that I've read and studied, was not a massive financial success in the sense that it didn't make money. It did employ about 10,000 people in the middle of the Depression. But even more important, I think it was successful in raising the consciousness of Texas, that here is a place that's dynamic, that's innovative, that has a spirit that we can overcome. We can do amazing things. Come to Texas, move your business here. And I think that's the real legacy of the Centennial for me, is putting Texas on the national map and showcasing that Texas spirit, which we still have today.
And what you've said a couple of times, we wish we had a time machine to go back and experience this. And while we don't, if people find themselves in Dallas today, we do want them to know that they can come to the Hall of State and step back into history.
Absolutely. We are appreciative of those that come and share our history. We're a member-based organization. We're a nonprofit. And people don't realize that we're open year-round. A lot of people come to the Hall of State during the fair and view the exhibits, but we're open year-round. We are free. We don't charge admission. We have a variety of programs, including historical lectures, discussions with authors. We also have a field trip program. Thanks to the generosity of HEB, we can actually reimburse schools for the transportation costs and provide box lunches. So students can come out and view the exhibits and learn Texas history in a fun and engaging way. We're also leveraging technology to modernize how we present that history. We can't really alter the building. The building itself is a historical monument, but we can use augmented reality and technology to bring those stories to life. We're working on a digital scavenger hunt so that people can have a conversation with the statues in the Hall of Heroes, and some of the artifacts will come to life and learn those stories in a more engaging way. So we just really want people to come visit, and we want to continue our mission of preserving and presenting the history of Dallas and the history of Texas. So come down to Fair Park if you're looking for something fun to do in Dallas. We'd love to see you at the Hall of State.
Thank you to both our guests today, Ernesto Rodriguez and David Lee. Be sure to check out the podcast notes. We've linked to a digital copy of a book with amazing photos of monuments erected for the Centennial, including a look inside that old Alamo Museum. We've also linked to the Dallas Historical Society's website that has photos of the beautiful Hall of State and information on how you can plan a visit. Plus, we've linked to a video and photos of the large Battle of the Alamo diorama there that we discussed in this episode. You've been listening to Stories Bigger Than Texas, the Alamo Podcast.